Welcome back. In this one, we're going to wrap up our to-do application. We're going to be spending pretty much the entire time in our two JavaScript files, and I'd actually like to start with a small challenge involving to-do app.js. The code that we're going to look at is this code right here. What does this code do? It listens for the form submission, it creates a new to-do, and it makes sure to save and render the updated list of to-dos. The problem that we saw in the past is that I can click add to do, and it's going to try to add something, even though there's no text content inside of there. So you're going to be doing a little bit of work inside of this function to actually change that behavior. So right here, there are a few comments for this one. There are really just two steps. First up, I want you to get a trimmed version of the input. So even if I were to type some spaces, I don't want to count that as a string with content. So we're going to start by getting a trimmed version of the input using what we learned previously. Then we're only going to add a new to-do. So we're only going to run this code if the trimmed version of the input actually has characters. So if its length is 0, we're going to do nothing, not responding to the form submission in any meaningful way. Only if there is a length greater than 0 are we going to choose to add the new to-do and then actually go ahead and save things. So take some time to knock this out using what you've learned so far in the course, then test your work. If you just add spaces or you have no content and you click add to do, nothing should happen. If you do add some meaningful content and click add to do, you should actually see that text showing up in the new to do that's created. All right, pause the video, and when you're done, click play. How'd you do? Let's go ahead and kick things off by getting the trimmed version of the input. Now we're going to store this in a variable as opposed to passing it in directly to text, because what do we need to do? We need to actually use a little bit of validation. We need an if statement that checks its length. So up above, we can go ahead and create a variable. I can use const text, for example, setting it equal to. In this case, we're going to set it equal to e.target.elements.text.value, exactly what we have down below. This time, though, we're going to use trim on that string to get the trimmed version. So that was step 1. Step 2 is to only add the new to-do when there's content in text. So we're going to add a little if statement. If text.length is greater than 0, then and only then are we actually going to run all of this code down below. Actually, e.preventDefault is not included in that. This should sit right up here, as I mentioned in the challenge setup. It's not part of the conditional stuff. This stuff is all conditionally done though, so we're going to cut that out. I'm going to paste it in the if statement, and the last thing we need to do is actually use the trimmed version of the string for the text value. So right here, we can set it up, referencing the text variable. Now, when we have a property whose value comes from a variable with the exact same name, we can use the ES6 object definition shorthand, and we can set it up just like this. So if we just have a name right here, it's going to look for a variable in scope. It is going to then create a property by this name and use the value from the variable. So this code right here is identical to this code right here. They get the exact same thing done. Now that we have this in place, we can actually remove the challenge comments and test our work. I'm going to go ahead and save the to-do app file. Over inside of the browser, let's go ahead and clear all of our existing to-dos. I'm going to click add to-do, and we can see that nothing happens, which is great. I'm going to add some spaces in and click it. Also, no new to-do added. Then I'll finally add something in. Go to dentist. And there we go. Go to dentist actually does show up, and we have the trimmed version, so all of those leading spaces were removed. And this really isn't changing the style of the application, but it is something important that I wanted to take the time to add in. Now we can close down this file, and we can move into the other file where we're going to be doing quite a bit more work. That is to-do function, and the goal inside of here is to just work with the DOM structure we're creating. We need to alter it a little bit and add some classes into the mix. Down below, I want to start with the generate to-do DOM function. This generates the to-do element, which makes up the little element we show for each to-do. We have our checkbox, our text, and our button. We're going to be altering this function to add some classes and change the structure a little bit. The first change we're going to make has to do with the element type that we use right here for to-do-L, the root element. We're going to switch this from being a div to being a label. That is going to allow us to click anywhere in the little box that we're going to create, so we don't have to specifically get our mouse inside of that checkbox. So that is the first change. The next thing we're going to do is we are going to add another element into the mix. We're going to create a separate div, and that's going to make it really easy to style things. We're going to keep the checkbox and the text on the left-hand side, and we're going to push the remove button off to the right-hand side. So right here, const container element equals document.create element, and we're just going to be making a new div. Then down below, we really just need to make a few changes to our setup. The first thing we're going to do is change this line right here. We want to put the checkbox and the text inside of the new container we just created. So instead of to-do element, I am going to use container element, and I'm going to append the checkbox right in there. Down below that, we set up our text. We're also going to change this one. No longer will we append to the to-do element, we will append right inside of our container. Now the last append call we have for the remove button is going to stay where it is. We don't want to put that in the container. The container is going to contain the stuff that gets pushed up against the left-hand side. Down below this, we have our remove button. I'm going to change the text from just an X to the word remove. And we're also going to add a class for this button. We're actually going to add two classes. So remove button.classList.add. And to pass in two classes, we just call add with two arguments. You can call it with as many strings as you like, each one being an individual class. So the first class is going to be button. Then I'm going to pass a second argument to add. The second class is going to be button hyphen text. Perfect. Down below the button, let's go ahead and create a new section to set up some classes for the container and the to-do element. Right here, setup container. And we're going to kick things off by adding a class to the to-do element. So that's to-do-L dot class list dot add, and we are going to pass in the class list hyphen item, and we're also going to add a class to the container we created. So the container dot class list dot add, adding in this particular case list hyphen item underscore container. The last thing left to do is to actually render the container, and we need to render the container before we render the button. So we want the button to come after the container because the container contains our checkbox and our label. So I'm actually going to take this little block and just move it up here. Then as the last line for this little block, I am going to use to-do element dot append child, and we're just going to drop container in place. Awesome. Now we can remove the extra lines we had down below. I can save to-do functions.js, and over in the browser, what do we get? We get a styled to-do item. We have our checkbox, we have our label, and our remove button, and we can see that as we hover over it, the background slightly changes. Another nice thing is that since this entire box is a label, I could click down here to check the box, I could click the box or the label itself, all of those work, and I can still remove the button by clicking my remove button. Now that we have this in place, let's go ahead and add a couple more items like item 1 and item 2, for example. And I just want to show you the DOM structure for what we actually created. I'm going to crack open the developer tools, and if we click this little guy right here, it's actually going to allow us to select an element from the page. And we're just trying to select something near this container. In this case, we can see that we have two labels, 1 and 2 for the two to-do items, and we have a class of list item on them. In there, we have a div container as the first one. The second one is our button. In the container, we have our input, the checkbox, and our span text. So this is the DOM structure that we just created by making some changes to our function over here, generate to-do DOM. So that is it for this function. There are a couple of other small tweaks we're going to make, and to knock all of that out, we're going to jump into challenge mode. The first challenge lives down below in generate summary DOM. We're going to make some changes to this, which is the summary message right here. There's a class I'd like you to add to it, and we're also going to talk about one more change. So step 1 for this one, super easy, add a class to the summary element. Step 2 is to pluralize to-dos unless you only have one, in which case it would be to-do. So this should read something like you have 0 to-dos left if you have none, you have 1 to-do singular left if you have one, and in this case, something like you have 6 to-dos plural left if you have 6. So I want to see the S unless you have just one incomplete to-do, in which case we don't want the S. So take as much time as you need to knock that out, then test your work. Go ahead and pause the video. All right, how'd you do? I'm going to kick things off by adding the class. That one's pretty easy. So right here, summary dot class list dot add, adding in list title. Nothing too exciting there. The next thing I wanted you to do, though, was to work on this pluralization problem. Now, you might have gone ahead and set up an if statement, having a condition to check if you only have one incomplete to do. If so, you set text content equal to one thing. Otherwise, you set it equal to something else. We know how we might go about solving the problem in that way. So I'm going to go ahead and use the conditional operator as an alternative solution. So right here, what I'm going to do is create a variable such as plural. And the goal of this one is to either be an empty string or just the letter S. So I'm going to start by adding my conditional in. Right here, we set plural equal to. I'm going to check incomplete to-dos, and I'm going to look at its length. If its length is equal to 1, then what do I want plural to be? An empty string. Otherwise, we're going to have it be the string with the character S. Now, all we need to do is use plural right here after the O in to do. So I am going to inject it, plural, just like this. Now we're going to have an S or nothing, in which case nothing is going to show up. And there we go. We've solved step 2 of the challenge. I'm going to go ahead and actually test things out by saving the file. Over in the browser, we can see the class was applied, and we now have a little space above and below our message. It's a plural currently. You have 2 to-dos left. If I mark one of these off, it says you have 1 to-do left singular, which is great. If I check all of them off, I'm getting you have 0 to-dos left. Plural, which is perfect. So there we go. That is the first challenge I wanted you to knock out. There is just one more quick one, and then we'll be all done. The last challenge lives up above just a little bit inside of our render to-dos function. Inside of here, we have the code that actually loops over all of the filtered to-dos, and it actually puts them into the DOM. This is great, but what if there are none? In that case, we want to render a little empty message like we did for the notes application. So we're going to add a little bit of conditional logic, only actually running this code when there are items in the array. Otherwise, we'll print a little paragraph to the screen. So down below, I have some comments for getting that done. If there are to-dos to show, we're going to render them using the code right here. If there are no to-dos to show, we're going to render a paragraph instead, and we're going to add the class empty message and some sort of text message like no to-dos to show. So it takes some time to knock that one out, super similar to what we did for the notes application. Test your work by actually deleting all of your to-dos or filtering them out. When you're done, you can go ahead and click play. All right, let's go ahead and kick things off by setting up the if statement. That's going to happen right here. If. And the only thing we care about is whether or not there are filtered to-dos to show. So filtered to-dos.length is greater than 0. If it is greater than 0, that's awesome. We're going to render it using the code up above. Otherwise, we'll do something else. Now we have all of that code right here, so we can take this for each call, and all we need to do is cut it out from its current location and paste it inside of the if code block. We can then remove those empty lines and focus on the else clause. Inside of else, this is where we want to create and render that paragraph. So const, I can call this something like message element equals document dot create element. We're going to create a new paragraph, and down below that, we're going to set the class up as well as the text content. So I'll start with the class first. Message element dot class list dot add, adding in empty message. Awesome. Next up, we want to set the text content for the message to show to the user. So we can set message element.text content equal to something. I'll use the exact message from below. No to-dos to show. Awesome. The last thing to do is to actually render this by appending it where we would have appended the actual individual items had there been any. So document dot query selector. We are looking for what? We are looking for the element with the ID of to-dos. And what are we going to do with it? We are just going to append something inside of it. Append child, appending in our message element. Perfect. Now we can go ahead and save the to-do functions file. And over inside of the browser, we should be able to see this message when we have no to-dos showing up. I'm going to delete the two we have and we get our little message, no to-dos to show, making it a bit nicer to actually work with this application. It gives you a bit of feedback and you know that if you add one, the message goes away. So there we have it. We have the final version of our to-do application. It's all styled, and we also added some new functionality inside of the JavaScript file. Now, when you made the change to this function, you might have also stored the result from query selector in a variable. Since we do use this one 4 separate times, we could go ahead and knock that out as well. That would be a fine addition right here, for example. Const. I can call this one like to-do element. I will store the result of query selector. Then down below, we're just going to reference that variable. We'll add it once right here where we clear the HTML, once right here where we add that summary message, once right here where we sometimes render a to-do, and once down below where we sometimes render that empty message. We can wrap this up by deleting the challenge comments, and that's where we're going to stop for this one. If we save things, the program still works, which it should, because while we have done a bit of refactoring, we haven't changed the actual functionality. That's it for this one. The topic of the next video is hosting, so we're going to figure out what it's going to take to get a real live URL so we can actually hand that out to others and they can visit and use our applications. I'm excited to get to that, so stay tuned and I'll see you soon.